She was 14 years old and entirely alone in the world, and the county placement agent who delivered her that news did so without unkindness but also without any particular gentleness, simply a tired man reading from a tired ledger. Her name was Josephine Rourke, and in the spring of 1897, within the space of 11 days, a fever swept through the small farming settlement of Millbrook Hollow and took her mother, then her father, then left her standing in the yard of a house that would pass, within the month, to a cousin she had met only twice who had no room in his life or his heart for a grieving orphan girl. She left Millbrook Hollow with $14 sewn into the lining of her one good coat, money her mother had been saving toward a sewing machine, and she walks out along the creek road until she reached the town of Ashford Bend, where she spent that $14, every last coin of it, on a collapsing, waterlogged tannery that had sat empty and reeking of old lime and rot for 6 years, a building so far gone that the man who sold it to her seemed almost ashamed to take her money. She told herself it was shelter for walls and a roof, however broken. She did not yet know that beneath the tannery's rotted floorboards, sealed inside an old tin box wrapped in oilcloth, waited a secret that had been buried there deliberately by someone who had once loved that town more than his own safety, and that unearthing it would not only give Josephine Rourke a life she could never have imagined on the day she buried her parents, but would return to Ashford Bend a piece of its own conscience that had been quietly missing for a generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Rourke. If you have ever felt like the world handed you nothing but a burden and cold at the beginning, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read everyone. Josephine had been born in 1883 in Millbrook Hollow, a small creekside settlement in the hill country, the only child of Daniel Rourke, a tanner by trade, and Margaret Rourke, who took in mending and, in better years, taught the settlement's handful of children their letters in the front room of their house. Daniel Rourke was a broad, quiet man whose hands were permanently stained the deep amber brown of oak bark and hemlock tannin, and he ran a small tannery on the edge of the creek where he cured hides for the farmers and trappers of the hollow, work that most people considered unpleasant and low, but which Daniel approached with a craftsman's seriousness that Josephine absorbed before she was old enough to understand what she was learning. He used to let her stand beside him at the vats, small enough that she had to be lifted onto an overturned crate to see over the rim, and he would explain, in his slow, careful way, that a hide nobody wanted, stiff and foul and seemingly ruined, held inside it a strength that only patience and the right process could bring out, that the difference between a piece of trash and a piece of good sound leather was rarely the hide itself but the willingness of the tanner to do the long, unglamorous work the hide required. Rushed leather cracked and failed. He told her, leather given its proper time became something a man could trust his life to, a boot sole, a harness strap, a saddle that would hold a rider through 20 years of hard country. Josephine did not know, as a small girl balanced on a crate, that her father was teaching her more than a trade. She only knew that she loved the smell of the tannery, sharp and earthy, and the low, steady rhythm of her father's voice explaining the invisible value in things other people were quick to discard. Her mother's lessons ran in a different but complementary direction. Margaret Rourke had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher in a river town further east, and she carried into her marriage a fierce, quiet belief that knowledge and record-keeping were a kind of armor a person could carry through hard times, that a woman who could read a contract, keep a ledger, and write a clear letter was a woman who could not easily be cheated or dismissed. She taught Josephine her letters before she was 5, taught her sums not long after, and made her practice penmanship on scraps of butcher paper until her hand was steady and legible, a discipline Josephine resented at the time and would later come to understand as perhaps the single most valuable inheritance her mother ever gave her. Margaret also carried a deep and showy compassion for anyone the settlement treated as lesser. When a widow 2 farms over fell behind on debts to the general store, it was Margaret who quietly organized the other women to bring extra preserves and mended clothing through the winter so no one would have to know the widow had gone hungry. When a drifter with a broken leg was refused shelter by half the households in Millbrook Hollow, Margaret took him into her own front room without a second thought, and told Josephine, as she changed his dressings, that a person's worth was never measured by their circumstances but only ever by their character, and that the surest way to know a town's true character was to watch how it treated the people it had the least reason to help. Harbored one particular grief that Josephine only half understood as a child and would not fully understand until years later. He spoke, on rare occasions, of a man named Silas Whitfield, who had once been the most respected figure in Ashford Bend, the town some 15 miles south where Daniel had apprenticed as a young tanner before settling in Millbrook Hollow. Silas Whitfield had been, In the years before Josephine's birth, the founder and superintendent of the Ashford Bend Mutual Trust, a small cooperative fund that pooled the savings of the town's farmers, laborers, and tradesmen, a fund built on the simple, old-fashioned premise that ordinary people, distrustful of distant banks after the panics of prior decades, could do better trusting one honest man among their own community than any institution beyond it. Silas Whitfield had run that trust faithfully for nearly a decade, and Daniel, who had deposited his own modest apprentice wages into it during his years in Ashford Bend, spoke of him with a reverence he extended to almost no one else. But something had gone wrong. In the year 1881, 2 years before Josephine's birth, something Daniel never fully explained to his young daughter beyond saying that Silas Whitfield had been accused of great wrong, driven from Ashford Bend in disgrace, and had vanished from the region entirely, and that Daniel had never quite believed the accusation was the whole truth of the matter, though he could offer no proof otherwise. It was, Josephine would later realize, one of the few subjects that could bring genuine sorrow to her father's face, the sorrow of a man who had watched someone he respected destroyed by a story he suspected was incomplete. This was the inheritance Josephine carried into the spring of 1897. Her father's patient eye for hidden value, her mother's discipline with letters and figures, her mother's fierce belief in the worth of the overlooked, and a half-understood family grief attached, though she did not yet know it, to the very town where her $14 would soon lead her. The fever came in April, sweeping up the Creek Valley the way such sicknesses did in those years, indifferent to virtue or preparation. It took Margaret Rourke first, in the space of 4 days, and Daniel, weakened perhaps by grief as much as by the illness itself, followed 9 days later, leaving Josephine, not yet 15, entirely alone in the small house above the tannery with a scattering of neighbors too frightened of contagion to do more than leave food at the door. The county placement agent arrived a week after Daniel's burial, a tired, not unkind man named Mr. Pruitt, who explained, with a flat efficiency of long practice, that the house and its small remaining debt would pass to Josephine's cousin, a farmer 2 counties over named Cyrus Boone, and that Cyrus had agreed, reluctantly by letter, to take her in, though his letter had made clear he expected her labor in exchange for the roof over her head, and had no patience for a girl who considered herself above field work. Josephine met Cyrus Boone exactly twice before she made her decision. The first time, he looked her over the way a man might assess a horse he was uncertain he wanted, and said she looked strong enough. The second time, when she asked, with careful politeness, whether she might be permitted to continue her schooling, he laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with a particular dismissiveness of a man who had never once considered a girl's schooling worth discussing, and said the creek didn't need another woman with fancy letters. It needed hands willing to work. Something in Josephine, in that moment, hardened into a decision. She did not tell Cyrus Boone. She did not tell Mr. Pruitt. She simply understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she would rather face the world with $14 and no name attached to her than spend her girlhood as unpaid, unschooled labor in a house where her mother's lessons and her father's patience would be treated as fancy nonsense to be beaten out of her. She took the $14 her mother had been saving for a sewing machine, sewn into her coat lining against exactly the kind of desperate need she now faced, and on a gray morning in late April, she left Millbrook Hollow on foot, telling the one neighbor who asked only that she was going to stay with distant kin, a lie that cost her something to tell but that she judged necessary. She walked the 15 miles to Ashford Bend not entirely by accident. She had heard her father speak of the town often enough that its name felt, to her grief-numbed mind, like the closest thing to a destination she possessed, and perhaps, too, some unspoken part of her hope that a place her father had once loved might offer her some fragment of shelter, though she could not have explained this reasoning to anyone who asked. She arrived in Ashford Bend on the second evening of her walk, exhausted, blistered, and increasingly aware that $14, however carefully guarded, would not stretch far in a town where she knew no one and possessed no trade of her own beyond what she had absorbed as a child watching her father work. It was on her 3rd day in Ashford Bend, sleeping in the loft of a livery stable whose owner had taken pity on her for one night only, that she heard 2 men discussing, with a particular relish men reserved for other people's misfortune, the sale of an old collapsing tannery down by the Eastern Creek crossing, a building that had sat empty for 6 years since its last owner died with no heirs willing to claim it, a building the town had tried and failed to sell twice already because no one wanted the expense of tearing it down, and no one wanted the trouble of restoring it. Josephine's ears caught on the word tannery, the way a hand catches on a familiar tool. She asked, carefully, where the building stood, and was directed, with amused indifference, to a sagging structure at the creek's edge that even from a distance made her chest tighten with recognition, not of the specific building but of the particular kind of neglect her father had taught her to look past. She found the man handling its sale that same afternoon, a weary town clerk named Elias Cobb, who seemed almost embarrassed by the property he was tasked with disposing of, and when Josephine, a 14-year-old girl travel-worn and alone, asked what he would take for it, he named a figure so low it barely qualified as a price at all, more an admission that the town simply wanted the liability off its books. $14, she told him, all she had, and Elias Cobb, who had expected to wait months more for any offer whatsoever, accepted with a shrug and a look of pity he did not bother to hide, remarking, not unkindly but not gently either, that a girl her age had no business owning a wreck like that and would likely regret it by the first hard rain. Josephine signed the paper in her mother's careful, disciplined hand, the very penmanship she had once resented practicing, and walked to her new property with the loss of her money gone and nothing left in the world but a broken building and whatever she could make of it. The Tannery, up close, was worse than she had allowed herself to fear and better than she had allowed herself to hope, in roughly equal measure, which was itself a kind of lesson her father would have recognized. The roof had partially collapsed on the northern end, where the old curing rack still stood in silhouette against the evening sky, and the smell of old lime and long-dead tannin hung in the air even after 6 years of abandonment, a smell that struck Josephine not with revulsion but with something achingly close to comfort, the smell of her father's hands. The southern half of the building, where the main workroom had stood, retained most of its roof and walls, though the floor had buckled and warped from years of unchecked damp rising off the creek. She spent that first night huddled in the driest corner she could find, wrapped in her coat, listening to the creek's steady murmur through gaps in the boards, and she told herself, with a stubborn practicality her mother had instilled in her, that a roof half-collapsed was still a roof, and that tomorrow she would begin the work of finding out exactly how much of this ruin could be saved. It was on her second morning in the building, while attempting to clear debris from the buckled workroom floor in hopes of finding solid boards she might salvage or repair, that Josephine noticed one section of flooring near the old curing vat set slightly higher than the boards around it, as though it had been lifted and reset rather than simply warped by water, a discrepancy so small that anyone without her father's trained eye for hidden seams might easily have missed it entirely. She knelt and worked her fingers along the edge, and after some effort, the section lifted away cleanly, revealing a shallow cavity dug into the earth beneath, and inside that cavity, wrapped carefully in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle with age, sat a tin box, rusted it seemed but intact, sealed shut with a simple hasp that had not been opened, by the look of the dust and cobweb sealing its edges, in a very long time. Josephine sat back on her heels in the gray morning light filtering through the broken roof, holding that tin box in both hands, feeling the same cautious, curious thrill her father used to describe when he examined a hide that looked ruined but might, with patience, prove otherwise. It took her the better part of an hour, working the rusted hasp gently with a flathead nail she found among the debris, to open it without damaging whatever lay inside, and when at last the lid came free, she found not coin, not gold, but papers, carefully folded and remarkably well preserved by the oilcloth wrapping, a thick sheaf of documents in a firm, educated hand, and resting atop them, a single letter addressed simply to whoever finds this, written by a man who signed himself Silas. Whitfield. Josephine went very still when she read that name. She had heard it before, spoken with sorrow and reverence in her father's voice across a dozen quiet evenings. The founder of the Ashford Bend Mutual Trust, the man driven from town in disgrace 2 years before her own birth, and here, impossibly, sealed beneath the floor of the very tannery she had just spent her last $14 to buy, sat his own private accounting of what had truly happened. The letter, dated the 3rd of September, 1881, explained everything Daniel Rourke had never fully understood. Silas Whitfield wrote that he had been accused, that autumn, of embezzling nearly $2,000 from the mutual trust depositors, an accusation brought forward with great public conviction by his own trusted bookkeeper and business partner, a man named Hollenvoss, who had produced falsified ledgers appearing to show years of Whitfield's secret withdrawals. The town, shocked and frightened for its own savings, had turned on Whitfield almost overnight, and rather than face a trial he suspected Voss had already rigged through bribed witnesses and forged documents, rather than risk debtor's prison and the total ruin of his family's name for a crime he had not committed. Whitfield had made the desperate decision to flee in the night, taking with him the true, unaltered ledgers of the trust, The original documents that would prove Voss's own hand. Behind every falsified withdrawal, intending, he wrote, to gather evidence from a distance and eventually clear his name. He had hidden the true ledgers here, in the Tannery where he had won apprentice as a young man decades before under its original owner, a place he trusted precisely because it belonged to no one connected to the scandal, sealing them beneath its floor with the intention of returning within the year once he had secured proof of Voss's guilt from contacts in the neighboring counties. But Whitfield's letter, dated barely weeks after his flight, carried an unmistakable note of fear beneath its careful prose, a fear Josephine slowly realized as she read further, that he might not survive to return at all, that Voss's associates had already threatened him, that he wrote this letter and sealed it away as insurance against his own possible death, so that if he never returned, whoever eventually found this box would at least possess the true accounting and might, someday, see the town's true thief exposed and its wrongly accused founder's name restored. He had, in fact, never returned. Josephine spent the following days, once the initial shock of the discovery settled into something she could work with rationally, piecing together what had become of Silas Whitfield through careful, quiet inquiries around Ashford Bend, framed always as a curious girl asking about the town's old history rather than as someone holding evidence that might append it. What she learned, slowly, from older residents willing to gossip about events 16 years past, was that Silas Whitfield had indeed vanished that autumn of 1881, and had never once been seen or heard from in Ashford Bend again, that most of the town had long since concluded he had died in disgrace somewhere on the run, his guilt confirmed by his own flight, and that Harlan Voss, the very man who had accused him, had in the years since risen to become one of the town's most prominent citizens. Having taken over management of what remained of the mutual trust assets after Whitfield's disappearance and eventually parlaying that position into ownership of the town's largest general store and a seat, now, on the very town council that had once, 16 years before, formally banished Whitfield's name from any position of trust in Ashford Bend, Josephine understood, reading and rereading Whitfield's ledgers by candlelight in the Tannery's dry southern room, that she now held something that could genuinely unmake a powerful man's reputation, and that this same discovery, properly handled, could also finally return honor to a name her own father had grieved for years without ever knowing why justice had failed him. The ledgers themselves were meticulous, the work of a careful, disciplined mind, showing years of trust deposits and withdrawals in Whitfield's own steady hand, and cross-reference against them, in a second smaller ledger clearly written later and in obvious haste, notes Whitfield had made comparing his true figures against the falsified version Voss had presented to the town, notes identifying specific discrepancies, specific dates where Voss's ledger showed withdrawals at Whitfield's. Original records proved had never occurred, evidence that, laid side by side with Voss's own long-published accounts, might still, 16 years later, prove exactly what had happened. What struck Josephine most, though, reading late into that first week alone in the Tannery, was not merely the financial fraud itself, but the human cost the letter described almost as an afterthought, the dozen or more small depositors, farmers and widows and tradesmen of modest means, whose savings had never actually been stolen by Whitfield at all, but had instead, according to his careful notes, been quietly redirected by Voss himself in the years following the scandal, folded into Voss's own, expanding business interests under cover of the very panic and confusion Voss had engineered. These were people, Josephine slowly understood, who believed to this day that Silas Whitfield had stolen their savings and vanished, when in fact the man who had actually taken what little they had was the very neighbor who now sold them their flour and their nails and sat in judgment over the town's affairs from his seat on the council. She was 14 years old, orphaned, alone, sleeping in a half-collapsed building she had bought with her last coin, and she now possessed evidence capable of destroying one of Ashford Bend's most respected men. She understood, with a maturity grief and necessity had forced upon her early, that she could not simply march into town waving Whitfield's ledgers and expect to be believed. A girl her age, with no family, no standing, no proof of who she even was beyond her own claim, accusing the town's most prominent citizen of a 16-year-old fraud, would be dismissed or worse, would place her in genuine danger from a man who had already, if Whitfield's letter could be trusted, shown himself willing to threaten and perhaps worse to protect his position. So she did what her mother had taught her to do with any difficult problem. She made a plan, methodical and patient, before she acted at all. She spent the following weeks rebuilding just enough of the tannery to make it minimally livable, patching the worst of the roof with salvage boards, trading her labor-mending harness leather for a local farmer in exchange for basic food, careful never to draw more attention to herself than a quiet, hard-working orphan girl fixing up an abandoned building might naturally attract. In the evenings, by candlelight, she copied Whitfield's ledgers in her own careful hand, preserving the original safely wrapped again in fresh oilcloth, and she began, with the same patient diligence her father had once applied to a difficult hide, cross-referencing Whitfield's old figures against whatever public records of the mutual trust later dealings she could find in the town's own records office, a small, dusty room she was permitted to visit as any citizen might, where she discovered, to her quiet satisfaction, that several of Voss's early business acquisitions in 1882 and 1883, the general store chief among them, had been financed through loans whose original source, buried in old paperwork nobody had examined in over a decade, traced directly back to mutual trust funds that should never have left depositor hands at all. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Ashford Bend, that Josephine's quiet presence and her repeated visits to the records office would eventually draw notice, and it was Harlan Voss himself, now a heavy-set, prosperous man of some 50 years with silver-shot hair and the comfortable bearing of someone long accustomed to deference, who first grew suspicious of the orphan girl living alone in the old tannery and asking careful questions about records 16 years old. He came to her one afternoon in early June, ostensibly to inquire, with performed neighborly concern, whether a girl so young truly ought to be living alone in a half-ruined building, and Josephine, watching his eyes move with poorly concealed unease toward the stack of papers she had left visible on the workroom table, understood in that instant that he suspected something, even if he could not yet know precisely what. She was careful, in that conversation, to reveal nothing beyond polite gratitude for his concern, but she understood, too, that the quiet, methodical pace of a plan had just acquired an urgency it had not possessed before. Voss did not wait long to act. Within the week, he had gone to the town council, of which he remained a respected member, and raised a formal concern about the ownership of the old tannery property, arguing, with the same performed civic worry he had shown Josephine directly, that the sale to an unaccompanied minor with no legal guardian had likely been improperly conducted by Elias Cobb, that the property ought by rights to revert to the town pending a proper determination of the girl's guardianship, and that in the meantime it would surely be safer and more appropriate for the child to be placed with a respectable family, an offer he made, with transparent self-interest Josephine alone fully understood, to personally sponsor himself. It was a maneuver designed, she recognized immediately, not out of genuine concern but to gain legal control over the very building where Whitfield's evidence had lain hidden for 16 years, and possibly, she suspected with a chill, to gain control over her as well, a 14-year-old girl who could then be quietly managed, silenced, or simply removed from Ashford Bend entirely before she could act on whatever she had found. Josephine understood she had perhaps days, not weeks, to act, and so she made a decision that would define the rest of her life, rather than wait, hide, or flee as Whitfield himself had once done. She chose to go forward, openly and immediately, to the one person in Ashford Bend she believed might actually listen to a 14-year-old orphan with an impossible story, a semi-retired circuit judge named Horace Bellamy who had presided, though only newly appointed at the time, over the original 1881 hearing that had formally stripped Silas Whitfield of his position and his name, a man now elderly, respected, and, as Josephine had learned through careful town gossip, known to harbor his own long, unspoken doubts about the swiftness and thoroughness of that original proceeding. She went to Judge Bellamy's home on a warm evening in mid-June, carrying Whitfield's original letter and ledgers wrapped once more in their oilcloth, and she told him, plainly and without embellishment, exactly what she had found beneath the floor of the tannery she had bought for $14, and exactly what those documents appeared to prove. Bellamy listened to her entire account without interruption, his weathered face unreadable, and when she finished, he sat silent for a long moment before asking, quietly, whether she understood the gravity of what she was alleging against a man as prominent as Harlan Voss. Josephine, drawing on every ounce of her mother's disciplined composure, told him that she understood it fully, and that she had not come to him with accusations but with evidence, and that she trusted him, as a one man in Ashford Bend who had actually presided over the original injustice, to judge that evidence honestly rather than to protect a comfortable status quo. Judge Bellamy spent 3 days examining Whitfield's ledgers against his own old case files and against public trust records he still had access to, and at the end of those 3 days, he summoned both Josephine and Separately, Harlan Voss to a private hearing at the town hall, ostensibly to resolve the question of the tannery's ownership, but in truth, as became rapidly clear once the proceeding began, to re-examine the entire 16-year-old scandal. Voss arrived confident, dismissive, prepared to characterize Josephine as a confused child manipulated by forged papers of unknown origin, and it was only when Judge Bellamy produced, alongside Whitfield's original ledgers, the town's own surviving loan record from 1882, records tracing the very funds that had financed Voss's acquisition of the general store back to accounts that should have remained under mutual trust protection, that Voss's composure finally visibly cracked. He blustered, at first, that any such discrepancy was merely poor bookkeeping from a chaotic period. But Judge Bellamy, drawing now on his own long unspoken doubts about the case he himself had once ruled on, pressed him with a precision that revealed the judge had clearly suspected some version of this truth for years and had simply lacked, until now, any concrete evidence to act upon. Within that single hearing, faced with documents whose internal consistency and dating made fabrication essentially impossible, Harlan Voss's careful public reputation began to unravel in real time, and by the hearing's end, Judge Bellamy formally ordered a full county investigation into the original 1881 trust affair, an investigation that would, over the following months, thoroughly vindicate Silas Whitfield's name and expose the true extent of Voss's fraud. The investigation confirmed everything Whitfield's hidden ledgers had claimed. Voss had indeed falsified the original accusation, had indeed redirected depositor funds into his own subsequent business ventures, and faced, that autumn of 1897, formal criminal charges that ultimately cost him not only his general store and his council seat, but very nearly his liberty. Saved from prison only by his advanced age and a plea arrangement that required him to surrender the bulk of his remaining assets in restitution to the very depositors he had wronged 16 years before. It was not, in the end, a punishment born of anyone's vengeance, least of all Josephine's, who had sought throughout only the quiet correction of a wrong her own father had grieved without ever understanding, but it was, unmistakably, justice arriving very late and finding, in the end, that it had not been forgotten after all. What mattered more to Josephine, in the months that followed, was the restitution itself, the careful, methodical work of identifying every depositor whose savings Whitfield's ledgers showed had been wrongly diverted, and seeing those funds, drawn now from Voss's surrendered assets under the county's supervision, finally returned to families who had spent 16 years believing their trust had simply been stolen by a man who vanished into disgrace. She worked alongside Judge Bellamy's office through that autumn, her mother's careful penmanship and disciplined bookkeeping proving invaluable in cross-referencing old names against current addresses, and she had a particular satisfaction, one crisp October afternoon, of watching an elderly widow named Constance Reyes weep openly on her own front porch upon learning that the $40 she had lost in 1881, money she had long since stopped even mentioning aloud, would at last be restored. To her, with the years of interest the county investigation determined was owed. Silas Whitfield himself, it emerged through careful inquiry, had died in 1889, 8 years after fleeing Ashford Bend, in a small town in Kansas where he had lived out his final years under a changed name, still gathering, according to letters found among his own effects there and forwarded eventually to Judge Bellamy, quiet evidence of Voss's guilt that he had simply never found a safe means to deliver, evidence that, combined with what Josephine herself had already unearthed, closed the case entirely. He never lived to see his name restored. But Ashford Bend, at Judge Bellamy's formal recommendation and with the unanimous support of a reconstituted town council, restored it posthumously that winter, striking his name from the town's old record of disgrace and inscribing it instead, alongside a brief accounting of the truth, on a small plaque placed at the town hall, a quiet correction 16 years overdue. We began this story by telling you that a 14-year-old orphan girl, alone in the world with $14, bought a collapsing tannery by the creek in the town of Ashford Bend, and that beneath its floor waited a sealed tin box that would change her life and restore something to an entire community. That girl was Josephine Rourke, and what she found beneath those rotted boards was never simply old paper and rusted tin, though the ledgers themselves proved the difference between a man's ruin and his restoration. What she found was her own father's unfinished grief, unknowingly laid to rest 16 years before her birth in the very building fate, or something very much like it, had led her to purchase with her last coin. She did for a stranger's name what her father had never been able to do, and in doing so, she honored the patient, unglamorous lesson he had taught her at the tanning vats of her childhood, that a thing left too long for ruined, whether a hide, a building, or a man's reputation, often still holds, beneath its neglected surface, exactly the strength that patience and honest work can finally bring back into the light. Josephine Rourke remained in Ashford Bend, rebuilt the tannery into a modest, respected trade of her own over the years that followed, and became, in time, known throughout the county not for the scandal she had uncovered, but for the same quiet, careful diligence that had uncovered it, a woman the town came to trust precisely because she had once trusted the evidence of a dead man's careful hand over the comfortable reputation of a living one. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Josephine's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever felt written off too soon. We would love to know, in the comment below, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that the world around you had already given up on? We read every answer, and we are always glad to have you here with us. Until next time, stay close.